All right, guys, so to wrap up our discussion on osmosis, we have to take a look at recognizing that this process is happening in living things. And so, in order for cells to maintain their homeostasis, they have to be able to deal with the fact that they're going to end up in environments where it's going to be hypotonic and water is going to be rushing into their cells, or they're hypertonic. And how do they deal with all of this? So, we're just going to take a look at a couple of examples. So, if I look at something like protists. These are single-celled aquatic organisms, so they live in a watery environment. And in order for them to deal with the fact that sometimes those situations, sometimes those environments are hypotonic, so water's rushing into their cells, the only way for them to deal with that is to actually have evolved these contractile vacuoles. So remember we talked about those vacuoles back in cell structure, and they're basically a cell sump pump. So as that water is rushing in order for them to keep from bursting because they don't have any other way to stop it, those contractile vacuoles pick up the number of contractions, they contract more often, and so they're able to expel that excess water and be able to maintain their natural cell size and cell shape. If we talk about something like saltwater fish, right, they're surrounded by solutions that are hypertonic to their cells. So if they didn't have any other way to combat this, they would just end up getting dehydrated by the water that they live in. So instead, their body has evolved these specialized gills that actually pumps out the salt from the water before it allows the water to get across their gills, and that's what's going to allow them to prevent dehydration. Your plant cells actually have a very unique way of dealing with this. And that's because they've got a cell wall, and that cell wall sort of acts like a girdle. It only allows that plant cell to swell up so much, but it prevents it from bursting. It prevents it from taking in too much water. Your protists, on the other hand, are animal cells, and so they don't have that cell wall. And so that's where those contractile vacuoles come in instead. Now, your plant cells will actually create this pressure inside their cells. As they are in that hypotonic environment, more and more water rushes in, it fills that central vacuole, that big structure there in the center of the cell, and as that central vacuole expands and fills with fluid, it ends up pushing out on the cell walls and it exerts this pressure, something called turgor pressure. And it's actually a good thing for your plants because remember, your plants don't have a skeletal system. So in order for them to be able to stand up nice and tall, that pressure, that turgor pressure, is actually necessary for them. So having a little extra water and a little extra pressure in their cells allows them to stand up. Now, if you forget to water your plant for a few days, what ends up happening? It's sort of losing water. Plant starts to wilt, starts to fall over because it's not having that enough turgor pressure for it allowed to actually stand up and have that structure. So when we look at the difference between animal and plant cells, as far as where these cells might find themselves in an environment, some environments are actually better than others. So if I go down my plant cell, all right, isotonic, they're going to maintain a regular, steady shape. It's actually okay for them. It's what we would call their cells would be flaccid, or what we were looking at with the plant, where they're sort of wilting over. They've got enough water to maintain their metabolic functions, so they can do photosynthesis and things like that, but just not enough rigidity for them to be able to stand up nice and tall. Hypertonic, not so good for your plant cells. All right, it's going to pull water out of their cells, cause their cells to shrink and shrivel up. They're dehydrating, and so that's not good for them. But what your plant cells actually prefer is a hypotonic environment where we get that excess water flowing in, and that's going to allow that turgor pressure to build up, allow them to not only have enough water to function, but also to have enough pressure to stand up nice and tall, which is where they prefer. And so hypotonic is actually best for an animal, or excuse me, for a plant cell. On the flip side, animal cells, hypertonic is going to be bad no matter which side of the coin we go, plant or animal, because it's dehydrating the cells, it's pulling the water out. They need that water to survive. Hypotonic, however, bad for your animal cells because they don't have a cell wall. They don't have a way, unless there's something like a protist with that contractile vacuole, they generally don't have ways to get rid of that excess water. So it's like overfilling a water balloon. The more and more you pump water in, the bigger and bigger that cell gets until it can't expand anymore and it just bursts open. So animal cells like us actually prefer an isotonic solution. We maintain that steady flow of water in and out, we maintain a cell shape, and that's the best situation for those animal cells.